want to be very careful to say that you and I are living in a culture where what God has designed for men needs to be advocated and endorsed by people who are reading the scriptures, working with Christians, and saying this is what God has designed for us in order to have impact, in order to have intimacy, in order to be the kind of men who alter the eternal implications for our wives, for our sons, for our daughters. But the only way to do that is by getting at a plan that God has unpacked, God has revealed through his word. And today I want us to be able to grapple just a little bit with identifying the kind of impact, the kind of influence, the kind of intimacy that God has called us to as fathers in concert with homes, families, wives, not in isolation. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm looking at the way Jesus did this that the Apostle Paul begins to explain. You say, what is that? Well, remember, Jesus comes on the scene, and what Jesus does is what no Israelite, no Hebrew has understood prior to that. Prior to Jesus' coming on the scene, prior to his coming on the scene, every Hebrew, every Jew had a particular way of relating to God that was somewhat distant. He was Yahweh, he was Adonai, he was El Shaddai, but there was not the level of intimacy that Jesus brings now as the one who's revealing the Father. In the Old Testament, God's wrath as well as his peace, his shalom, was understood, but not with the same level of intimacy that Jesus has now come on the scene to reveal. When they prayed, he was more of an arbitrary and in some cases personal yet distant reality for them. And so Jesus comes on in a more radical way to show them something about the Father they had never understood before. Remember the ancient world when the scribe would write the name of Jehovah or Yahweh or Adonai, he would pencil in the name, then break the pencil, and then go wash, change his clothes, and come back. Why? Because the name of God was too holy, too revered. Even the way we pronounce Yahweh today is hard to verify because the name couldn't be spoken. The name could not be uttered. And so their understanding of who God the Father was distant, was not nearly as intimate as Jesus comes on the scene to provide. So when Jesus comes on the scene, Jesus says something like this. He says, now, when you pray to the one you have been praying to, I want you to pray this way. Pray, our Father. And the whole room got quiet. He was calling God Father. Jesus spoke in Aramaic. And when Jesus used the word Abba, he was using an Aramaic phrase that could be translated as my daddy. And every religious person on site would have thought that a radical idea. How can you now take the one who's the creator of everything, the one who we perceived as somewhat close but yet distant, and now reduce him to something as common as a phrase as Abba? How dare you become that personal with the Lord of all creation? And Jesus was trying to help them to understand something, that my presence as the reveal of who he is has changed now how we relate to him through a different level of intimacy because of who I am. This is why Jesus becomes the centerpiece, the pivotal piece of our relationship with the Father, because he not only bridges the gap in a sort of theological way, but he bridges the gap in a very personal and intimate way. And what we need by design are fathers who understand what deep levels of intimacy look like and are committed to living with a kind of closeness, a kind of engagement, a kind of intimacy, a kind of dwelling down that makes their presence powerful in their own homes. I was thinking about this some years ago as an illustration of the life my wife and I have shared for more than 35 years. And it was at a time in ministry when I thought that I should pack up books, pack up materials, and go home because I was spending too much time out of the home for one reason or another. And I remember going to the house, sort of setting up my station there, and very proud and puffed up that now I'm at home and I know that that's what pleases you. And she had that look on her face that only a black woman can have. When you know there's thoughts percolating behind the face, but you're afraid to ask. And finally, I utter the courage to say, what's the matter with you? I am home. And she says to me, yeah, you're here, but I wish you weren't. And I said, what do you mean? She says, because when you're here, you ain't here. And sometimes that's what men do. Men can be present, but still disconnected. They can be in the same room, but their minds, their thoughts, their hearts are somewhere else. And what we need are fathers who understand what it means to be present and engaged with what's going on in the household then and there. Men, sometimes you've got to resign your other jobs before you get in the door. You got to take off your corporate hat, take off your ministerial hat, take off whatever hat you got on. You got to resign those jobs, and when you step in the house, just be a husband and a father. And until men embrace that level of intimacy, we can never be the fathers that God has designed us to be. And we clearly can't be those kinds of men if we're always talking rather than listening. Because most men have a natural predisposition to when they hear a problem, they go to wanting to fix it. But most of the times what the people in our households don't want is for us to fix it. They just need somebody to hear it and listen to it and then embrace them because you feel the kind of pain that they feel. Am I making sense to anybody? And the idea of intimacy becomes something that Jesus introduces for every man that would be the kind of father that he calls us to, but there's something else in the text that you can't miss. When Paul is identifying children in this text, Paul is not at all talking about just what it means to be a part of an individualized community as father, as wives, then as children. He has spent a lot of time talking about the framework of family that involves wives, that involves husbands. Now in verse 1, he's dealing with children, and now in verse 4, he's dealing with fathers. He's doing this because Paul sees all of this as a community that God wants to work through as a whole and not in isolated individual pockets. Whatever God does with wives is impacting the family. Whatever God does with children is impacting the family. And whatever God is doing with fathers is impacting the family. And so he's not operating out of some isolated understanding. He's operating out of what this intimacy means when finally men become mature and recognize their role in relationship to other people. You see, you're young once, but you can be immature your entire life. And God is trying to get men to identify with this new maturity that has nothing to do with how old you are, how long you've lived, and what you possess. He's trying to get them to see it in connection with the responsibilities they have, not just as men, but as fathers connected to others. And someone will easily say, well, you know what? I don't have any children. That's not the point. He's trying to eliminate the concept of people, men, women, children, seeing themselves in isolation. And this is why some of what we would call discipleship, while necessary to disciple men, while necessary to disciple women, while necessary to do ministry for kids, demands a rethink that connects men to their role as fathers, women their role as mothers, and children their responsibility in the household as a collective unit, not just as isolated entities. And when Paul gives this kind of edict in chapter 6, as he lays out this process, this plan, is because he realizes that what starts in the home then moves to the corporate center and then the battlefield called the world. That's what Ephesians 6 is about. He starts in the context of the home, saying to brothers that your home is not your castle. Your home is your first church. Your home is the place where you, man, are supposed to be the priest and the pastor of your home. And if you are faithful in that calling there, it will change the corporate arena. It will change the way families do battle in the world, because you have been faithful to your responsibility as father, not just a man, in that home. We are disconnected, and we have bought into 21st century thinking that has fragmented us. And if I'm a good man, then I've got to understand why I'm a good man in relationship to others, not just a good man by myself. Because I could live on that island forever. But if my life is going to impact somebody else, then I'm not just a good man for the sake of being a good man. I've got to now be a good father and a good husband and a good friend and a good brother, because my life impacts the lives of everybody else around me. That's what Paul is getting to. And the reality might be that we all need help in this, because it's much easier to think of ourselves as people who live on islands of isolation. So Paul says, wait a minute. I want you to recognize that a part of your role is to be a teacher. And Dan Williams would remind you that you can't teach what you don't know, and you can't lead where you won't go. To walk with a swagger in your crib because you got testicles. Yeah, I said it. Is to be impotent. The responsibility of the father is to teach. To teach, teach, teach by example, by precept. His responsibility is to not soak up air, eat food, and swag and brag about I'm the man. Because if you got to call yourself the man, it's because nobody thinks you are. Real men don't have to tell folks they're men. Somebody else is saying that's a real man. And the fact that you call yourself a man means you might have a problem because nobody else is. It is not what you possess, it's what comes out. And men are called to teach, and here's the deal. You may not think you're teaching, but you're teaching something. Now, I don't know what you're teaching, but you're teaching something. You're either teaching them what not to do, you're either teaching them how not to be, but there is no such thing as a void, no such thing as a vacuum. And Paul says, I want you to train, hyperextend, teach. I want you to be the leader and the teacher in that home. One of the reasons why we have boys posing as men is because they haven't been taught what it means to be. The reason why we have little girls going after a particular kind of man is because they haven't been taught what to look for in a brother. Some girls will go after the first thing that comes their way, winks and blinks at them and says, hey, shorty, you want to be on my team? Like, since when did that become, like, attractive? I heard a guy telling a girl, yo, shorty, I want you on my squad. What? And you mean that was attractive to you? First of all, he needs to be slapped for saying it. And here's what it told me. The fact that a sister might be reasonably interested in that kind of approach says that some way a father didn't do what he was supposed to do. Teach, train. But then he says, I want you to do it in a particular way. I'm teaching them because why? Obedience becomes a part of Christian discipleship that's not just predicated on status and authority. It's what we do. So we're teaching them to obey. And in the lives of many of our young men, I've heard them say to me things like, you know what, I'm going to join the Air Force, I'm going to join the military, I'm going to the Army. Why? Because my mommy and my daddy's rules are too strict. So I'm thinking, all right, you're going to go into the military because mom and daddy's rules are too strict? Yeah. Okay, like what? I mean, you got to take out the trash? All right. So I'm going to leave that home, go into the military where they're going to tell me what to wear, what time to get up, what time to go to bed, what I can eat. So you're leaving that environment for another environment that's more filled with orders. Look here. Before you can learn how to give orders, you got to learn how to take them. And that's what fathers are designed for. You know what? I'm getting off my outline, but I want to do it for a second. Do you mind? Ladies, this is why you got to understand that there's a certain toughness to your spouse, to your husband, to the father, to the man. There's a certain toughness that you got to allow him to just have, because his responsibility is to train the child to live outside of the home. Now, ladies, your responsibility is not to be as tough as that man. Your responsibility is to be a nurturer. But sometimes women get bent out of shape when hubby is too tough. And every now and then, I'll acknowledge that some men get too tough. But understand that God built him like that, because that's what he's got to prepare those youngins for. When they get outside of the nurturing environment, they got to be able to stick and stay. And so God sends a father to develop them so you have somebody with a kind of strength and external toughness and internal resolve to make it when things go hard. And rather than chide each other for our differences, we ought to recognize that men and women are equal, but they're different. And can't no woman teach a man, a boy, how to be a man, and can't no man teach a young girl how to be a woman. But he can model some things that allow that young lady to make a well-informed decision about the kind of man she should date, i.e., or marry. Paul says, train them. Train them. But he doesn't just say train them. He says, train them and or with the instruction that comes from the Lord. Let me hustle. Paul says, I want you to also be a transmitter of truth in ways that gets them ready for the roles they have to play. Now, honoring parents is basic, fundamental. It's a responsibility and a virtue that we need today. But there's something else in this text that I want you to be clear about. When Paul is talking to them about doing this in a way that comes from the Lord, Paul is saying you can't just decide to teach what you want. You have to teach them not only through a model of intimacy, not only through a level of instruction, engagement, involvement. You have to teach them in a posture that has eternal ramifications because it comes from God himself. And when Paul would have written this letter to the people who were receiving it, they would have seen this as radical. You say, why? In verses 1, he says, children, obey your parents. And everybody there who read that letter would have said, we got that. And guess what, Paul? You need to take that letter back because we've already been doing that. But then he goes one step further and forward and he says, look, fathers, I want you to not provoke your children to anger. I want you to teach them, and I want you to teach them, listen, in ways that come from God. And the whole world would have stopped and said, wait a minute, here's why. In the ancient world, the culture of the ancient world would have been that children have absolutely no power. Children would have not been respected in the ancient culture. In the ancient culture, children were identified as apparatus, as things, as objects. A father in the ancient world could take his newborn daughter and drown her just because she was a girl. In the ancient world, fathers would take handicapped children, deformed children, and abandon them in the woods. When a father saw an imperfection in a child, in the ancient world, what they would do is simply discard them. Because in the ancient world, the father had that kind of power over children. Children had no rights. They were not respected. So when the Christians in this culture get this letter that says to them, wait a minute, there's a different kind of reciprocal respect, in that, yes, children are to respect their parents, but parents have to respect, honor their children. The whole congregation would have sat up, because it was counter-cultural. That now a parent, a father, has an obligation to revere and respect a child. Jesus would say, yeah, because my way will always be different from the cultural norm. This is why a father who is working out what it means to be a Christian is also prone and given to be able to sit on the side of the bed of his son or his daughter and periodically say, how am I doing? How have I failed? How have I hurt you? And then to ask forgiveness from a child. You see, if you want your stock to go up with your kids, admit that you've blown it. And then when you admit that you've blown it, ask them to forgive you for being too quickly angered, for being unjust in your decision making, or not taking the time to listen, and your stock will go up immediately as a man they want to emulate. You will have sons and daughters that love you like a fat kid loves cake. The problem is that from time to time, our understanding of what it means to be a man does not consist of being able to respect and recognize the ways in which I have hurt particularly children. And so children are as abused in Christian homes as they are non-Christian homes, because men have not been framed to understand their role as fathers in the context of a family the way Jesus has described it. Paul was saying, no, I'm pushing back on this. Because not only should a parent be respected, but a child needs to be respected and revered and loved. It doesn't discount discipline, but it's the way you discipline. And Paul says, do it with instruction that comes not from Dr. Zeus, not from Dr. Phil, but from the Lord. It'll change the way you live, the way they live, because that is God's design. Now, here's the issue. I said to you, you must respect children. Children must respect, honor, revere, according to the scriptures, their parent. Let me get everybody on the same page. Child and father, sons and daughters. Respect is not earned. You've been told that lie so long, you actually believe it. Respect is not earned. Respect is given. You give respect. I don't have to earn respect. You don't have to earn it from me. Respect is not earned, it's given voluntarily as a matter of what's doing, Paul would say, what's right. It is the recognition that even though I am your father, everybody is on a journey, and fathers are a little further down the road than you are, which means I know some things that you don't know. I've experienced some things you haven't experienced. I'm not better than you, but I know some things you don't know. And somebody says, well, experience is the best teacher. No, you can learn from my experience. You don't have to do everything I did in order to learn, if you'll listen to me. My mama, when I was younger, she said to me, don't touch the iron, because if you touch the iron, you'll get burned. And I heard her. But that iron was calling me. And so by the time I got done with my little first, second degree burn, and she refused to put anything on it, she wanted me to sit there and cry, I learned a valuable lesson about hot irons. And what I like to say to young people who always say to me, well, you got to give me a chance to experience my own life. Yes. And I know you got to learn from your own experience. Yes. But I got some experience that if you listen to me, I can tell you what not to do so you don't bump your head in the same way I bump my head. And I'll do it in a way that respects you, and I want you to hear me in a way that respects me. Last point, and I'm done. When Paul is finished with this, Paul is working on what is their understanding of ethical monotheism and eschatological hope. I just felt like doing it. They believed in one God. They believed in one God. One God who was going to come back and return for them to change their condition. And so what God did was, God kept his promise, and he sent his son as a model of what fatherhood could be like. Because all of us have been adopted into the family of God. But when Paul writes this to these people, what he's clear about is that the only way we can embrace this is if we are transformed by the love of God. So that the only way you can give out this love is if you have first been a recipient of it. It's why I am so completely overwhelmed with what I'm seeing taking place in Charleston. You see, when I listened to the people in Charleston, and I heard them say things like, it hurts, but we can't hate. We've been called to love and forgive. I realized that you need a God to pull that off. And if you haven't been transformed by that love, you can't dispense that love. And God's plan for every man was that he would experience the love of God in a transforming way that would allow him to be the representative in his home of the love of God, so that no matter what happens, there are children who always have a divine reference point. That no matter where they go, they can point back to something. I'm done, but I want to make sure you get this. The prodigal son, the story of the prodigal son is rich. Not just rich because the boy went away and spent everything he had on riotous living. It's rich because after getting to the pig pen, if there had been no memory of a father, he would have been doomed to stay in the pig pen. The only reason the prodigal can get back up and go back is because in his memory there is a father who he has not forgotten, that if I can just get back to my daddy, I can find the love and the embrace and the kind of compassion that I've been missing. And some of us have not had those kinds of fathers. So what God did was he sent his son as the revelation of the Father and said, no matter what happens to you, if you can get to him, in fact, forget about getting to him. He'll come to you while you're in the pig pen and transform the pig pen into an oasis of strength and power and learning and love that you'll need the rest of your life. That's been his plan from time immemorial. For every man, for every woman, for every person. And on this Father's Day, that plan that involves intimacy and involvement, that gives all of us an eternal hope, is found in nobody but Jesus Christ. Do I have a witness?